Okay, so thank you so much for the kind invitation to ReSAKSS. And let me tell you something. I need you to be very focused because for the people that know me, I will run. So given that I will run, you need to be focused on the slides I'm going to put in the screen so that you don't ask questions after I finish. Okay, so what I'm going to do is try to answer some of the questions of infrastructure. The chair already has summarized 2/3 of my presentation, but I will show you some pictures to bring that up. And what we have been hearing during the day today and yesterday basically is that we are in a process of growth in Africa, economic transformation, trade is important, especially regional trade. We need to improve competitiveness, we need to reduce harvest losses across the value chain, and we need to improve and reduce inequality by improving welfare and giving access to public services to households. Now, in the way we have today, the level of access to infrastructure, we will crash against a wall if we keep growing at the level we are in Africa of the Sub-Saharan. Because really, the region is not ready to be able to continue this path with the access of infrastructure they have. So my presentation is focused on 6 topics, and some of them only have 1 slide, so don't get worried. And I only have 15 minutes. So first, what we know on infrastructure in Sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa of the Sub-Saharan, of the south of the Sahara, estimated effects on cost, estimated infrastructure gaps in terms of immediate investment, why is central for increasing income and reducing income inequality, and I will just give you an example of electricity and rural electrification, importance of complementarities, and how we can move forward. And most of the presentation will focus in the last point on how we can move forward. So let me first start with this very simple table, where the only thing here I'm showing is basically what the chair was talking about. Now, if I look at this table 5 years ago, the situation was even worse. But if you look at the last 3 columns, you will see what is the level of access that we have for the different levels of infrastructure. So for example, population with electricity, urban, rural, in total, in average, 35% relative to low-income countries of 25. 5 years ago, this continent was lower than the low-income country level. So there has been some improvement, but it still is extremely low. Even worse, if you look at inequality within the countries of the region, the situation is very severe. So there are some countries which are improving, there are many others which are not. Population with access to safe water, 64%, close to the low-income countries. Population with improved sanitation, 30%. Telephone subscribers per 1,000 people, 11%, but that's fixed lines. Where there has been a significant jump is on cellular phones, and I will explain that a little bit later. And then paved roads, we are still in very low levels. If we look at the income distribution and look at what is the access across the different quintiles of the population, the situation is even worse, reflecting the inequality we face when we have economic growth also, and lack of infrastructure. So for the poorest quintiles, the level of access is extremely low relative to the richest ones. So for the quintile number 1, basically we have extremely low levels of access compared to the richest. So there is significant disparities across categories, and this gets even worse when we open it by countries. This is a picture of the continent just to look at access of energy. Of course, forget the center, but it shows you, compared to Europe, how far we are in terms of access to energy. When we look at roads, this is a situation that we faced in 1994, when we were able to collect data at that point in time. What this graph is showing is basically how much time I take to go to the closest market, and the closest market is defined by the level of population. How we calculate this is by a technology called raster analysis, where basically we measure how much time you will take going to a location using the roads in the condition they are, or using whatever pathway you have. So it's the optimal distance to that closest market. The lighter the color means the faster I will get there. The darker the color, the farther, the more the time it will take me. But if you look at it, we are basically, in most of the cases, in the best of the situations, between 1 hour, 40 minutes, and 1 hour. And then, of course, you have extreme situations, which are the darker greens. That was in 1994. If we look at what happened in 2000, we see some improvement. Look at the change. It became more lighter. That means that there were more roads being improved or built. And if I look at 2010, which is the latest data I have, again, I see an improvement. But still, we are mostly in the yellow category in the best areas. Very few reds, which will mean that I am very close to those markets. Now, this imposes a huge challenge if I am talking about being competitive, if I am talking about high-value commodities, and if I am talking about value chains and linking to global value chains. Because if I have a high-value commodity product, the time it will take to put it in the market or to take it to the airport will basically deteriorate the quality of the good and the price will be affected. Therefore, I'm not being competitive. Just thinking on agriculture, no? But think on other non-agricultural services, the situation will be similar. So there has been an improvement. It's not static, but it still is very slow and needs to speed up significantly if we don't want to crash with this wall that I was mentioning before, which many countries have already done it. Brazil is an example. One of the major bottlenecks of Brazil today is roads and ports. When we were in the food crisis, Brazil had all the supply to be able to export, especially in the drought of the US in 2011. And if you look at pictures of the amount of cars that were piled to be able to deliver because of the lack of good roads and lack of access to ports, was huge. They couldn't benefit as they were supposed to benefit because of that crisis. Now, where are the evolution of roads? This is basically the transatlantic corridors that are being planned and how they are planning to be evolved. It's important to look at those because in most of the cases, they are around the previous deployment of infrastructure of roads. But the advantage of Africa is that we also have a network of railroads that needs to be thought about, and we need to think how we can optimize that network and how we can improve it over time. So that's the story for roads. So improvement, small improvement, but significant gap still in the process. Cellular phones. Today, we basically have one cellular phone per individual in the world. So we are basically, the red line, which is showing the level of cellular phones, is reaching the level of population. I assume by today we already crossed the level of the population. Now, Africa or the Sub-Sahara is the only infrastructure where they have really outperformed. If you look at evolution and compare to other regions, you will see how much it had increased lately in terms of access to cellular phones. Now, why is this? It's because the continent is extremely attractive to it? Is because the regulation is attracting investment? Or is because the technology learned a lot in the years before and was able to leapfrog and move very fast into the continent? Because many of these things, if you look at Latin America, for example, happened 10 years ago in Latin America, this level of growth. Before, companies were very reluctant to go to rural areas or to poor areas. After what they found, that there was a potential market and the use of prepaid phones, they moved very fast. And my hypothesis will be that this learning allowed these companies to move very fast. But also, there is a lot of innovation in Africa in the terms of access to mobile phones. So that's the infrastructure that is moving the faster and when you can profit the most today. Now, but the situation is not the same for rural and urban. And I have highlighted in red here the countries from Africa. And you will see when you compare the column of rural and urban, with rare exceptions, like the case of Senegal, that there is a significant gap with the penetration of the rural and urban areas. And this is a paper we did jointly with Bart and Eduardo Nakasone. Why is this important? Because normally the statistics we get on cellular phones are at the total of the country level. They are not at the subregional level. So the gap still is there. So despite we have improved substantially, still we have an enormous gap in terms of access. But the one that worries me most is the access to broadband. Access to broadband is really, really lacked in the case of Africa of the Sub-Sahara. We are sitting today in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia exports broadband. The whole country has fiber optics, but the access to households is restricted. So how we can improve this and leapfrog here? We should have exactly the same figure as cellulars. Why? Because this allows us to have IP telephony and more information flow at a cheaper level. Remember that voice doesn't compete with data, so that will allow me to have very cheap access to IP telephony, like all of you do when you use wireless. This is how it looks at night, or the movement of amount of usage of broadband. Look at the continent. It's basically dark. Look at Latin America. Look at Europe. So we are not taking advantage of this. And when basically technology is extremely cheap and can be deployed very easily. Irrigation is another big problem. The agricultural land as a percentage of total land area is 50% in Africa of the Sub-Saharan, but irrigated land is around 3%, relative to an average of the world of 21%. And if we are worried about climate change, potential droughts, and so on, what happens in the Sahel, we need to change this and we need to improve on this and be very efficient in how we do it. And finally, the situation on ports. And this is very similar to what Brazil is facing and many other countries. There is a constraint in the location and sustainability of certain ports. Today, the size of the ships that do transportation is huge, and the ports are not located in locations where this type of ships can go through. Something similar to what is happening today in the Panama Canal, that they have to expand it to be able to move the Chinese vessels, and China is trying to do a canal in Nicaragua to avoid it. Port capability usually results from inadequate maintenance, impact of port efficiency, importance of legal setting, procedures which are pretty complicated, and there is a lot that we can learn in this, how we can improve the procedures of customs, and also there is the traditional non-infrastructure, non-official barriers. So imagine if I built a road that will increase my velocity of moving a commodity from a location to the port and reduce the time in 2 hours, but when I arrive to the port, because of all these issues, I take 2 days to move the commodity. Doesn't make sense, no? So I lose all the returns of the investment of infrastructure because of the port. So we need to look at this as a value chain. We cannot look at this by each type of infrastructure. We need to focus on it as a value chain. Now, what are the estimated costs as a result of this reduction of supply of infrastructure? This is basically looking at the infrastructure services, how expensive they are relative to elsewhere. And in all the cases, in power, in international calls, in water, in roads, in internet dialing, and in mobile telephony is significantly higher than the rest of the world. And it's consistent with a lack of supply. So it's basically reflecting the lack of supply. Now, what this means is that, of course, there is heterogeneity. Here is a list of countries. Few of them are of Africa. But it also brings the issue of the cost of access to the technology. We were talking about cellular phones and that there is a huge increase in access to cellular phones. But if we look at the prices within these countries, it could be that the prices are still too high because most of them are prepaid phones, and that could put you in a situation where the poorest households cannot have access. This is just to show you the case of a standard basic basket of cellular phones in Brazil. The red line shows the cost of that basket, and then the blue line is showing the income level, 5% of the income of the households across their income levels, how much they can afford of that basic basket of minutes. So as you can see, only the richest groups can afford that cost and not the poorest groups. And I assume something similar is happening here. I don't have the data for African countries, but that's something to look at and assess carefully. Now, what is the gap? And this was a study done by ICD with the World Bank, which basically tried to understand what was the investment gap that you need per year. Now, to put in context, to build 1 kilometer of road, you need around $1 million, more or less. So a road of 260 kilometers will cost you around $260 million. So the spending gap that we have in Africa in terms of infrastructure requires around $93 billion per year to be able to close that gap. Now, this is assuming that we have a gain in efficiency of around 17 billion per year, and this gain in efficiency is composed of increasing cost recovery, 4.7 million, prioritizing better, 3.3 billion, spending budgeted resources, 1.9 billion, and improving operational efficiency in 7.5 billion. But despite that, with the current level of expenditure of 45 billion plus the 17 billion, that's the gap we need to cover of additional infrastructure. And that's where the role of FDI is essential to be able to help to close that role, and also what the role of the private sector should be to be able to reduce that gap. Now, let me move to why it's central and just give you a very quick example. This example of electricity. And this is all the potential impacts that you will have with electricity. Basically, you will be able to save time, you will be able to be more productive in non-agricultural activities. But not only that, we just finished a study where we measure the amount of solid particles in the air because of using kerosene or other technologies. And when we use electricity on the grid, for example, or solar technologies, we reduce that level of solid particles, which improves substantially the breathing and reduces the health issues related to breathing of kids. So there is a huge impact on access to these infrastructures, and these things can be measured. And there is a lot of evidence today on what are the potential impacts behind this type of access to infrastructure. So we need to look at this carefully. There are short-term effects, medium-term effects, and long-term effects. Sometimes it's very difficult to capture the effects in this type of technologies. Roads, for example, if I build a freeway, it's very difficult to measure in the short term the impacts. Because sometimes you don't know what will happen because of the dynamics of the new road. So we need to be very careful to assess the returns of this type of investments. Now, let me move to the last point before going to the recommendations, which is on complementarities. And what we did is we basically did a study to try to look at what is the benefits of combining investments in infrastructure. We did this for Peru a long time ago, and we find significant returns discounting for the investment costs of doing two or more infrastructures together than just one. So if I build a road, I should be thinking in deploying electricity and in deploying fiber optics, for example. The same thing was found when we did it for Bangladesh. We find exactly the same result like we found to Peru. So complementarities when planning are essential and something to look at. So let me just finalize on how to move forward, and I will take a little bit, 3 more minutes of my time. So the first thing is the issue of regional. And in case of Africa, because of the amount of countries, the low level of population, penetration per square meter, the level of income, the international river basins, and the presence of landlocked countries, we need to think of infrastructure as a regional issue. We cannot think of it as a country-by-country issue. And that's essential. If we don't realize that, it will be very difficult to move forward. Kenya, Ethiopia are moving forward in linking in energy, for example. So we need to find ways to do that with other countries and try to find ways in which we create regional investments in infrastructure. Now, why is this important? Because if we look at the potentiality across the continent, we will find corridors over which infrastructure will benefit. And for example, the purple areas here, or the green areas, are showing potential corridors for agriculture. And I will show you a little bit of that later on. The second thing is that we need to prioritize. Because, of course, we have a budget constraint, and we have a significant gap, 93 billion. So how we do that? If my target as a government is to reduce poverty, I need to find ways in which the deployment of the infrastructure will be focused in creating income and therefore targeted to reduce poverty. And there is ways to do it. Normally, we do it in terms of economic rate of return. But we can also combine that with a framework of poverty rate of return. Remember, we're investing in public goods, it's public money. So how we can combine both concepts to be able to bring a higher return. That also means to be optimal in prioritization. And the problem you have in the deployment of infrastructure normally is that we are thinking in minimization of costs, and we are not thinking in maximization of profits. And that's because of the lack of data. So if I am deploying electricity, the electricity company, what they will do is they will deploy the lines where it is cheaper for them to do it. And normally where they will do it, where there are roads. But sometimes moving away a little bit will create a huge return. Because, for example, I have an area that specializes in any agro-processing product, which if I link them to the road, they will bring huge returns. Tanzania was doing that 5 years ago by basically linking key markets to the freeway and doing that little investment to link them to the freeway. And that created a huge return. But normally companies won't think that way. So one thing that we need to change is this paradigm on how I deploy the infrastructure. And this is basically, the concept is based on terms of ISO profits. So normally what we do is what is in the right-hand side, in your left-hand side, which is basically minimization of costs. And if I do that, I will get into a point like A. That's where I will deploy. But if I use the concept of profits and optimize profits, I will optimize in the combination of A and B. So I will go to B and then to A. That's where I will get the maximum profits. So there is a big difference. Now, how to do that? You can estimate ISO profits over the space, for example. And we do that by using stochastic frontiers. For agriculture, for example, we know where there is potential and where the households are. Then I can map over the space and identify the areas where there is a huge potential for agro-processing, and that's where I will estimate and deploy my infrastructure, because I know where I will maximize my profits. So changing the paradigm is important, and this is an application for the case of Mozambique, where we basically apply this, and the darker green areas are telling me areas where I have huge potential to be able to deploy infrastructure around those corridors. So in the case of deployment, I think it's very important to be out of synchrony. We need to think differently. there is where we can leapfrog, and I think we can get huge benefits. Now, financing is important, and as we saw earlier, foreign direct investment is going down. So we need to find ways to attract public and private investment. Governments are not supposed to build everything. There are areas where there are gaps where the government has to play a role, but there are areas where we can do and improve access to infrastructure. So we need to innovate and to deepen markets to get these niches and also to attract foreign direct investments for infrastructure. I already talked about the complementarities, and we need to think of those when we deploy, and that also helps in the cost-benefit analysis in terms of the deployment of the infrastructure. On regulation, I think it's important to look at increasing competition, open to new technologies, that's where we can leapfrog, open to new business models. For example, in electricity, prepaid meters in electricity, which in some countries of Africa, like Mozambique, are being used, but not across the board. We still use postpaid meters. If I live in a rural area far away, how I build that people? The company has to go back and forward to build them. When it's a prepaid meter, the consumer is the one that will recharge their car. And the beauty for them is that they will adjust what they need. They don't have to pay a fixed cost. So those advantages of the technologies available will help me to deploy and to increase access to this type of infrastructures. But also, when I want to reduce the gap, I can do competitive process. The government gives the minimum requirements, the companies offer the best technologies, and I pay the minimum subsidy through competition. And that has worked a lot in telecommunications, and it's something that has been used. One issue which is really important is on governance and accountability. Let's assume in the best of the world that we get the ODA or the FDI to cover the gap. If the money is misused, all is lost. So it's not just an issue of money. We need to have in place a monitor and evaluation mechanism. We need to find a way to reduce corruption through better institutions. This is exactly the example I was showing before. I was trying to link several locations. I was improving and investing certain amount of money to improve the roads and to improve the time to access to those. But then when we bring up the tolls that have to be paid and the corruption bribes that have to be paid, all my investment is lost. Because the gain in time, in this case I gain 4.40 hours or 1.70 hours, is lost because of what I spent, sorry, the 2.1, the 2.1, 1.9, 2.6 hours is lost because of the time I spent in stopping to pay all these bribes. So we need to have that in place to resolve the problem. So the idea is we need to put policies in place. The process has to be there, the institutions have to be there. It's not just an issue of money, so that we can really target and obtain what we are looking for. And finally, the issue of leapfrogging. I think Africa has a huge advantage. They can learn from other experiences and move faster. And you need to move faster, because the wall is approaching. So if you don't move fast, you won't be able to move. And especially here, where we want to focus on regional trade, you need to link the countries. And your infrastructure issue is regional. So you need to find ways to leapfrog and learn from the best technologies available and jump stages. Thank you.